Let's see, who is currently signed in as?
I got it.
Got it. Thanks. Perfect. So I know Sarah and Eric are quite knowledgeable about this subject and um, had info to share. And I don't know if this agenda even makes makes the most sense to people. I was thinking we could start with kind of just like background information, and then if it makes sense, move into like kind of like the limitations that we see, areas of improvement, potential projects. If that doesn't seem like the best, kind of framework for this time, I'm happy to adjust to whatever makes most sense.
It sounds good to me. I'm just struggling to find the agenda.
Oh, sorry. Let's see. Drop it in the chat.
And I wouldn't say I'm very knowledgeable about ECHO, but but I'm happy to give a little bit of background. And it seems like Eric's got also a good handle on it. And I'm also cautious that I feel like some of us already know this stuff. So I'm curious to know what level of background would be helpful at this stage. I put together a few slides.
Oh, great.
They're right here. So, I mean, I can give, should I just give a bit of background on where the ECHO website comes from? And then maybe you can dive into more of the data stuff, Eric. All right, so here is do you want me to share screen? Or is it, yeah? All right, and I might leave it this way so I can kind of see the rest of my screen too. Is that clear enough, or should I go to full screen? Okay, so here's just a screenshot of the ECHO website, the EPA's Enforcement and Compliance History Online. And what's so awesome about this website and makes it pretty unique in the world for government websites is that it provides raw monitoring data from polluting facilities across a really big range of things. So facilities that have Clean Water Act permits, facilities that have permits to release air pollution, at least for the Clean Water Act stuff, it's actual monitoring data of their effluent. So they have monthly reporting requirements. They have somebody who actually goes out and takes in-pipe samples. They're sent to a lab, and all of the parameters that they're regulated on are reported, and then also a lot of parameters that aren't regulated at all. So hundreds of other chemicals that they might not have permit limits on, you also have reporting data. So it's a pretty amazing wealth of information. And historically, this website was developed by the same people who produced the Toxics Release Inventory, which is the first inventory of its kind to make this kind of data available to the public. And the Toxics Release Inventory was all just about air quality data. And that was made by the federal government following the Bhopal disaster in 1984 in Bhopal, India, where a pesticide production factory released a huge gas of a chemical called methyl isocyanate, and it killed thousands of people and has in the long term contaminated large areas of Bhopal. And what people realized in the States is that that site was designed based on the same structure as one that was in West Virginia, and that EPA didn't have any regulation on methyl isocyanate storage, and it wasn't actually listed as a toxic hazard at that point in time. So this was a big sea change in right to know policy in the US that produced the Toxics Release Inventory, and it created a lot of change in how companies behave, because suddenly their emissions are being quantified and available to the public. And so you had things like Monsanto making pledges to cut their emissions by half in 10 years and things like that. So ECHO builds on that tradition. And in fact, the person at the EPA who's designed and built ECHO was mentored by the person who produced the TRI. And so the kind of really big change for ECHO versus TRI is that it is actually real monitoring data rather than a lot of estimated data that's in TRI. And it puts on top of that enforcement work by the EPA. So then what it's possible for the public to do is not only look at what's been released, but also to check the government's enforcement based on. And so there's potentially something really interesting for us to do here in looking at any separations between enforcement and compliance over time. And there's some really strange things about the way federal websites are developed, where there hasn't been a lot of user testing. So this website has been developed and come out in kind of fits and starts, and big changes are pushed when there's, administrations that are supportive of this kind of thing, and then, a lot doesn't happen for periods. And so the politicization of this stuff means that, this kind of has emerged and evolved in fits and starts. And there's also this act called the Paperwork Reduction Act that prevents federal agencies getting more than 10 people together to discuss something. And so there haven't actually been, to my knowledge, and based on interviews we've done with the people who developed ECHO, any usability studies of ECHO over time. So it's a really, really interesting website that hasn't had a lot of design review and engagement with users. And so EDGI's work to date on this comes from two different directions. During our EDJ event, we had a presentation based on a collaborative project that I did with an environmental justice group in Chelsea, Massachusetts, called Chemicals in the Creek, where we used ECHO to gather all of the violation data on the 7 oil storage facilities along that creek over 5 years. And we were working on data physicalization and made lanterns for each of those violations and put them out on the creek together. And so we were raising the question of just making this information available on a public website. Is that really making it available to the public? Is a website the right way to serve this information? Are there other really different ways to be interacting with this information? Because as we look through ECHO, you'll see that there's lots of acronyms on the site. You really have to have a pretty thorough knowledge of the regulations to understand the information. And it's not something that you can just dive into and necessarily understand. So that's one direction of EDGI's kind of work so far, is coming at this from an environmental justice question. And then the other way that EDGI's used ECHO data so far is in the Sheep in the Closet report, where Leif did a triumphant effort of looking at, of gathering all of the raw data on ECHO and analyzing it. And so those two projects have kind of conspired for us to think about, well, what could this website be if it was truly serving the purposes of informing the public and helping us check both emissions and government enforcement. So just a bit of background on where the information comes into ECHO from and what information gets gathered there. And these were produced by a student of mine, Alicia Cousins, and Lourdes also did a lot of work on this project. So discharges with permits to pollute basically they're regulated by a permitting authority, and they have to report their pounds of emissions per day or the concentrations, micrograms per litre, in their effluent. And they submit it using these discharge monitoring report forms, or DMRs. That goes to a permitting authority. And over the past 10 years, EPA has been working to digitize this whole system. But in a number of states, these are still paper forms that are submitted to the state level permitting authority, which is then manually entered into EPA's internal database, which is called ISIS, and is connected to this NPDES, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System database. Then that data is then pushed to the external facing ECHO website. So one of the interesting things about the Enforcement and Compliance History online website is that it's designed for the public, and internally EPA uses the ISIS database. So there's not a lot of EPA eyes on this website either. They also had this old legacy tool called the Water Discharge Monitoring Reporting Pollutant Loading tool, which has recently been folded into ECHO, but there used to be two databases that you could access through ECHO, and my understanding is they've recently been merged. And so we just highlighted on this slide some of the potential data errors here, because one question is how well is the raw data actually reflected on the ECHO website, and what is the data quality from the beginning, because still a lot of this is self-reporting, less data is required for non-major facilities, you have these manual data entry errors, there's also digital data entry errors that happen too, and then there can be these lag times of a week to 3 months between what's on the ISIS database and what's on the ECHO database. So I'll just stop there and see if Eric has anything to add.
So, yeah, that's really great. I don't have too much to add here, and anything I do add will come up through our discussion of some of the projects that we might advance as EDGI. I would say one thing to keep in mind here is that, just to reinforce what Sarah said, is that ECHO is one big portal that is trying to serve many different publics or constituencies or stakeholders, right? So, and they acknowledge this, right, in their frequently asked questions section. So it's purportedly supposed to serve local communities that would want to understand how facilities are affecting their community. It's meant to serve facilities themselves to make sure that the data that they're reporting to the EPA is showing up correctly. And in fact, there's a little data error reporting tool that facilities can actually use to say, hey, this is my facility, but the data here don't look like what we gave you. And then also state level regulators, as well as potential investors, get a sense of, what is this facility actually up to? So not only is it a mishmash of all sorts of data for various EPA programs, from clean air to clean water to hazardous waste, it's also serving lots of different user types, we could say. There's also something that's important, is that it brings in a lot of the EPA's environmental justice figures. So if you go to an individual facility, it'll tell you sort of the EPA's estimates based on census and other data of the demographic profile around that community. So potentially there's a lot of really valuable information that's getting mashed together, generally around individual facilities. There isn't a whole lot of aggregating that goes on in terms of, if you wanted to know who's the largest polluter of whatever chemical, that's not necessarily how the site is designed. That's not a question the site is designed to answer, at least anymore. It's really focused in on what is this one specific facility up to, and how has EPA been enforcing that facility's permit. Some other important data constraints to note in terms of enforcement, EPA enforcement and compliance data, that is currently restricted to 5 and 3 years respectively. So 5 years for enforcement data, 3 years for compliance data. And that has limitations in that if I want to know anything from the Obama era now, in terms of compliance for a facility, I'm pretty much out of luck. So it makes comparisons between, say, different administrations much more difficult. And that is something that's been on their radar for trying to improve. There's actually a list of things they've been wanting to work on and incorporate into the site that they haven't for various reasons. So that's something we might look to in our design review. Those are the things that come to mind, at least right now, but happy to dive in more as we talk about specific projects.
That's really helpful, Eric. So, I mean, I don't know where we want to go from here. We have a very helpful summary of the EDGI projects that we've been talking about that I linked at the bottom here, and Kelsey put together. And currently we're sort of falling into 3 project areas: usability studies, and doing kind of a design review based on the principles of environmental data justice that would also develop what an environmental data justice design review looks like, that could be applied to other kinds of sites. The idea of an echo watch, so trying to monitor a gap between enforcement and compliance, which is sort of challenging, but we could also be looking and seeing if compliance is just going out of whack because they know enforcement isn't necessarily happening either. And that, you know, is feasible potentially. And then there's this other kind of separate question of how enforcement is operating at the EPA. So when we did interviews with people at EPA Region 1, and we're asking them, that covers our Boston area, and we're asking them about these oil storage facilities, they said, oh, well, we haven't really looked at them because there aren't any significant violations there. And so we started investigating what they mean by a significant violation. And we were really struck by them saying, like, we actually don't know. We don't know what the algorithm is that's telling us. We just only look at the significant violations because there are so many violations. And just to give you a sense, I think I've said this a bunch of times, but 24% of companies in the US in the past few years have been operating in significant violations and of their Clean Water Act permits. And so when we then interviewed people at EPA headquarters about what that algorithm is, it turns out to be in significant violation. You have to be out of compliance on one regulated parameter, say benzene, for 6 consecutive months. And you have to be at least 20% over your permit threshold for those 6 consecutive months. So that means that if I'm out of compliance for 5 consecutive months and then back in compliance, and then no significant violation will be found. So one sort of the data justice kind of question is, how transparent is this algorithm in the first place? How is that put together? And then could we develop kind of counter algorithms that would identify if somebody's gaming this system? So we could try and see if somebody is doing that, like turning the tap off at 5 months because they know then they would get in significant non-compliance. So that's kind of an interesting possible project too. But again, all of these are pretty vast projects when you look at them, because just going back to slide 4 here, as Eric said, it integrates so many different kinds of data, and you can do so many different kinds of things using ECHO. So, you have hazardous waste stuff, you have safe drinking water information, you have the toxics release inventory, you have the Clean Water Act. So I think it's going to be really important for us to focus on some subset of this and not think that we can kind of offer necessarily a whole picture. So I have some other slides on what we've been thinking about for what an environmental data justice review is, and then some other slides on just what it looks like to look at some pages on ECHO. But I don't know what's a next helpful step for everybody else.
Yeah, Rob?
I guess I would also love more of a walkthrough, but I also just have a boatload of questions based on what's been said so far. So I don't know if it's a good time for questions or if we should sort of keep going through over here.
Yeah, I think this is a good spot to stop for questions. And
so I guess I have a huge number of questions, but my big baseline one, I guess, is were 2. So Eric talked about there being a sort of 3 to 5 year history, but that's all that's really displayed. And is there a difference between what's displayed from that perspective, timeframe wise, on the site versus what you get in their data products? Because I noticed there's a whole tab for data products. And relatedly, does what you get in the data products reflect pretty similarly like what you see on the site in terms of does it give you all the same measurements that you see? Because one of the things I've experienced as a problem with portals, other portals like this, on some agencies is that sometimes there will be stuff that's not in the published data set that does get displayed in some sort of roll-up summary on the site. So you get in this frustrating situation where you can't really get the data in a machine readable form, but it is displayed somehow. So I was just curious how those things match up, but also whether there's a difference in those two views on things as far as that time frame stuff.
To answer the first question, no, there is no difference between what's displayed or the time frame for enforcement and compliance data that's visualized on the detailed facility report and what is accessible in the bulk or facility data download or the web service, the API. It's all 3 and 5 year. As to the second question, in terms of what sort of things might get rolled up or aggregated, I think that's a research question, and in some ways, nothing comes to mind immediately. But there might be some things that are displayed in a more aggregate form and don't really mesh up with some of the more detailed data you get. I don't know. Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand the difference between the enforcement data because we didn't have any enforcement issues in Chelsea because none of them made it to significant violation status. We did ever try to look at the enforcement data, but you can see if something has been coded as a violation immediately. So for instance, if you look at, this is a detailed facility report for one of the places that we looked at, and this is updated weekly. So you can see if, and I'm not quite sure. Eric, could you tell us about how the enforcement data looks?
Yeah, so what we're looking at right here is actually compliance. Yeah, it's a mix of compliance and enforcement, I guess.
Yeah.
But I would call this a compliance. So is the facility in compliance with its permit? In some quarters, it is. There's no violation of its permit. In some quarters, there is a violation. Based on exceeding a certain percent of threshold of effluence discharge. But then the enforcement data would appear a bit below this on the detailed facility report, and it's essentially, has EPA fined the facility? Has it written a letter? That sort of thing. And they break it down into informal enforcement and formal. So it tells us about number of inspections, date of last inspection, fines, that sort of thing. And I've worked a bit with that data with Leif to see has the date of last inspection changed over the past few years? Like, are facilities becoming more routinely inspected or less routinely inspected under the Trump administration? And I can pull that analysis up later, but essentially we didn't do too much with it, but like facilities are not inspected as regularly now.
And can we FOIA any of that information? Or, because they must have all of that information in ISIS, right? So.
I mean, all this is in Echo too, right?
Yeah. I just mean 5-year update stuff.
Oh. Yeah. Surely they have it somewhere.
Did that help with answering your questions, Rob? Or are there other things to dive into?
I have many more if other people don't have questions. But that was super helpful.
I think you should go for it, Rob.
Okay. So especially related to that last one about getting older data. So it sounds like maybe there's an avenue for FOIA there. And I'm curious if we know if anybody else is like trying to archive this data to build a longer history or has been. And if nobody is, like, that seems like a straightforward and obvious, very technical project, but like one that doesn't require a lot of figuring things out. Like, we should just start archiving that data if it goes away, because at every moment that somebody's not doing that, some historical data is being lost.
That's an interesting idea. Kelsey, do you think we could do that with Brendan?
It's kind of hard to say. I wonder if we could personally put it up on Query. Like, that could be something that I could investigate. I haven't really spent much time doing it, though. I think Brendan is pretty overloaded and can't do it himself right now.
I mean, that's also a thing, like if that were a project we wanted to dive into, we could start looking around, especially, I guess, me, and maybe Dan and Brendan, at other people we know who would be interested in like working on that project in their spare time and helping out with it, or on the technical end, because it doesn't seem like a thing that should be especially hard to do. It just needs somebody to throw some time and effort at it.
It is a lot of data. And I just reiterate that, and it is an explicit goal to eventually include more than 5 years and of enforcement data and 3 years of compliance data. So somebody in EPA wants to do this and make the data available. It's just a matter of politics or budgets or something that has kept them from doing that so far.
Do you have a sense, just in terms of identifying the cost, like how much data it is per year, broadly speaking?
That's a great question. I don't know that. That might be somewhere.
Okay. Like that might be a useful thing just to identify order of magnitude. Are we talking about like a few hundred megabytes a year? Are we talking about gigabytes a year, tens of gigabytes a year? Are we talking about like petabytes of data? From looking at this, I'm sure it's a lot more than petabytes, but I don't know what there's orders of magnitude that would be useful to know.
Has anyone checked in with Chris? Because wasn't Chris and Sarah Landon were going to work on FOIA-ing something about ISIS, but I didn't know what it was. Does anybody know more on that?
My recollection is that they were actually going to look more into the algorithm and maybe FOIA that, but I'm not sure if any progress has been made there.
On that note about the algorithm, I think you said, Sarah, and maybe I just missed it, but if not, you sort of said like they don't know exactly what the algorithm is, and I wasn't sure who they was in that sentence. I wasn't sure if we're talking about community members or like EPA workers who are working on compliance and enforcement, or who we're talking about, like who actually knows how this thing works.
That was with EPA people at Region 1 who work on compliance and enforcement.
Wow.
I mean, because my sense is, and the sense that we got from these interviews, is that they're so overwhelmed with just even looking into significant non-compliance that nobody ever looks at the non-significant compliance issues.
Right.
It's a real question as to whether or not you want to call those things non-significant, because you can exceed your benzene permit by 5,000 times, and nobody will ever look into it. So, you know, I think there's a whole set of questions there about whether or not this is an effective benchmark, and it's quite clear that it's not, because EPA itself is trying to just reduce the significant non-compliance, or has been historically, because a quarter of companies operating at that level is just insane. You know, it's kind of insane, and it's not like the regions have a huge manpower, person power to put at these things. So, I think there's, beyond just thinking about how to change the website, there's this whole question about, like, is enforcement really happening under the current paradigm at all? And there's probably a lot we could do to just draw attention to that issue of mapping, like, these are the places that have been out of compliance for this many years. And doing some big graphics. This is a quarter of the companies in significant non-compliance. This is what this means, and do some digs into some of highlighting some cases where I think people are non-compliant and exceeding their permits by thousands of times and having no enforcement follow-up, and just kind of doing some work to highlight those cases. Because in essence, I think what I'd say we have now is a system that people feel like is working because it performs, but isn't necessarily actually serving its goals of.
Yeah. NIPD's is National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. It's in the name, but clearly that's not how it actually functions.
So just to clarify, though, on the algorithm part, so what we know is that basically EPA workers focusing on compliance and enforcement have an algorithm that's basically directing their work, because they only look at what's significantly non-compliant, and significant non-compliance is calculated from some algorithm based on how somebody is non-compliant, which is reasonably objective. Objective in terms of the numbers. Different question about whether the numbers you got to begin with were. But they don't know what that algorithm works, what that algorithm does, how it works. They don't know the history of it, so whether it's changing, when it's changed, and how. And neither do we, because it's not published anywhere.
This I'm not sure on.
So I happen to come across a little bit more on this. I'm sorry this is getting us into the weeds, but I think this might be helpful to advance what we want to do with ECHO and this project in particular. But so there is a little bit published about this on ECHO. I'll put it into the chat what I was able to find, or what I came across the other day, and it's in the Slack channel, but it's still a little bit of a black box. It's as Sarah described, but there's also this technical review criteria that come in that sort of modify it, that are not described anywhere in ECHO, that probably are still not transparent to regulators either. So, yeah. Well, it's not letting me paste it, but anyway. So there is a little bit out there, but it's still pretty opaque.
So, there's like a write-up we could do that's sort of illustrating what a transparent way of recognizing this algorithm looks like. And Laura Perovich and I, who did the Chemicals in the Creek project, had talked about what if we did performances, like what if we, did a physical kind of performance of how this algorithm operates that would illustrate for you what's getting sorted and what isn't, like a short video or something, and that kind of reveals how it works. I think there's some really interesting design approaches we could take to saying, like, this is what this is how algorithms should be represented by the federal government. Because otherwise it's just so hard for people to follow.
So it seems like a lot of the energy right now is about the kind of base data that's provided, and I wonder there's also discussion about kind of the user interface issues, and I wonder if we want to discuss that more, or if we want to kind of stay focused on the data side and see if that's kind of like what what EDGI really like wants to, that have capacity and passion for. Or do you want to also talk about the user side and see if there's also equal passion there?
I mean, I don't know which of these I feel more passionately about. It's kind of tricky because there's so many different things. I kind of feel like it's sort of different attempts for different kind of engagement for both. Like I almost want for us to offer like a design challenge and have a small stipend and invite artists like or Steve to apply to help us do some like really sensational graphics around Echo as one kind of set of things. Anyway, that's just kind of a side.
I really like that idea.
I guess I come with a particular bias of being a technician. But when we talk about doing a user study of it, after hearing especially about how many different types of audiences they're trying to serve or concerned about serving, and about the fact that the data services they provide are reasonably complete in comparison with what's displayed on the site. My sort of feeling is I feel like a user study there would be hard to do because you could do it from a particular perspective, but it might not be heard very well because that doesn't match what they're trying to achieve, both because what they're trying to achieve is too big and possibly fuzzy because it's so big. And it should be on some level like celebrated that the data is fairly complete. And that's a good thing because the value in there is that it lets other people approach, more particular and focused, visualizations or interfaces to that data. I think it kind of exists as a workaround solution to that problem of the fact that they have too many constituencies to serve any of them well. And like, they'll never serve them all well. And the user study will always show 5 billion failings because of that. So like, that's like my immediate mental reaction to that idea is that like, it's a thing we could do, but I don't know how well it would be heard from the other side because we'll never be able to give them a better answer because they're to do better probably in most cases would mean to be more focused than they're willing to be. And so I worry that avenue is not a super productive avenue versus other things we might do engaging with the data.
Or to create separate echoes that are tailored to each of those stakeholders, which might make sense, but also would be infeasible for them probably at this point politically and financially, right?
Yeah, I think probably they run into major resource constraints even in a supportive administration.
Yeah, Kevin?
Do they have an API into their data? And I wonder if other people are building interfaces using their APIs for different uses.
They do have an API. I can't say I know of anybody building I guess I've actually built somewhat of an interface into it as part of a larger project. I can't think of other examples at the moment though.
There are kind of some lower hanging fruit things to do with the user research. And it wouldn't even need user research per se, other than to kind of back up the, I don't know, like there's some stuff that's just kind of like, okay, well, if you had hover tooltips on acronyms that just told you what the acronym stood for, like that's not that hard and it serves a lot of different audiences. And I think that's kind of the state that Echo is in. And there's like definitely more things we could say, like, gosh, I wish you had a map for this and I wish you had a graph for that. But there is a lot of stuff that's in there right now that's just kind of like, if you're not an expert in this field, you will not be able to understand anything about this without a great deal of work. And so that's kind of what's exciting to me about the the Echo project, but only assuming that we have people on the inside who are interested in hearing those suggestions at all.
Well, and I kind of lean towards a more radical demonstration of what it could be that pushes their logic a little bit outside of the website as a way of giving this data. You know, it's kind of where I think I mentioned artist projects, like you know, why not have billboards outside of facilities with what their compliance has been? You know, what it seems to me like there's a kind of a need to break open the imagination of how this could serve the public, and that you know, while we can make some small concrete recommendations to improve the usability of the website, it might be more productive in the long term for us to push to be kind of offering really different conceptualizations of how people could interact with this, and kind of you know, just to try and stretch the imagination of what it could be for them. And, you know, if that could be realizable as like an API that's, or like an interface that's specifically designed for EJ communities that works with this database, then that might be a really kind of concrete thing that we could try and produce.
I think that idea is really cool, and I think it's really interesting, both in the like more artist perspective of different visualizations and conceptualizations of how to transmit that information, and also from the perspective of just get more people looking at it, even if they're like data scientists or somebody who want to make a different website that visualizes it differently, or a website that focuses on different industries or regions in the large, which I think you were sort of saying is poorly served, because this site is focused on being very facility specific. And I think like one, you talked earlier about like stipends, you know, and people applying for those to like do some work was a really cool approach. Like another approach that is somewhat successful is like having a sort of like hackathon or ideathon to help get those started, and then like if people come up with something that has some traction and want to keep working on, then like we have those stipends to help support people do that. And the valuable thing there is if you do those sort of hackathons well, you get not just artists and technicians, but you make sure you get a lot of community members or members from like EJ type groups who are interested in like what the data could do there, so that those artists and data scientists are interacting with like people who have actual direct needs out of the data, not just like pie in the sky, like, oh, we could visualize this differently. So like using that as a space to put those communities together, like activist communities and local communities, and then like artists and technicians in a room to like brainstorm like, oh, what could we do with this particular pile of data? Like, let's just dedicate a day to brainstorming that stuff. And then the tail end of that is figuring out, based on that brainstorming, what you can try and fund.
That also might be a nice kind of partnership building exercise where, like, you know, if we wanted to bring to the table something that, like, you know, we could do with like the, you know, counter algorithm work, and say, and kind of like, oh, you know, ask for collaborators who might be interested in kind of running with an idea of, you know, this like kind of different visualization or something. Could be nice, bringing different things to the table.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that we could pair it. It's making me think about the data rescue events, and one of the nice things with the data rescue events is where there were these sort of multiple tracks of work you could do. And, you know, one other thing that people could gather to do is sit and do an eco watch for their area and sort of go back through the facilities. And if we came up with a routine way so that at that event we've already gathered for this location kind of data that people could actually look at and sift through, we could try and structure kind of a toolkit for review, an in-place review of enforcement and compliance data, and this kind of more imaginative, what could you do with it? And then we could actually kind of try and structure not data rescue events, but kind of echo evaluation events, and try and think about toolkits that would support that. You know, it wouldn't have to be necessarily the scale of 200 people walking in the door to do work, but a workshop of 20 people.
I like that idea, and I do think that the in place, like the kind of place based people, are most interested in the facilities near them, and so that could be a nice kind of like on the ground edgy presence again.
I mean, it feels daunting to think about doing that, but on the other hand, we're actually already all distributed in different places, and like it's not that hard to get a group together in the Boston area to do a small version of this. You know, it wouldn't be that hard to do that in New York either, if we could think of them more as like event toolkits, and then, you know, our work over the next 5 months would be kind of putting together the toolkits for those events. And even if we just did it within the EDGI network, wouldn't be too much of a lift. And if it did catch on, we'd have that structure ready for it to catch on.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add that as it stands after this conversation, it seems like we've actually, you know, we started out with these 3 projects that we were thinking of working on, and now it's actually more like 1.25, 1.5, right? So we've kind of combined the Echo Watch and the counter algorithm projects into something into this, you know, toolkit idea generating events project. And then the user review, it sounds like, and we should talk about this, it sounds like there might be more interest in a broader envisioning of what Echo could be through those you know, on the ground events. But I still think, you know, we have this connection with Echo staffers at EPA through Leif and Chris. They are interested in hearing from us. So I do think we should do, if not an actual user review, some sort of review that does highlight the kinds of things that Kelsey mentioned, like tooltips and, you know, data availability, timeframes, those sorts of things, and just get that in a letter that we send to them, and because I think that's an important connection to maintain, and a good objective for our work. So 1.5, 2 projects.
Yeah, and again, if we thought about doing the usability study in a way that it's developed as a toolkit. So, you know, here's a 1-page document about how you can do this thing. Then you submit as a screenshot of the thing that you would recommend. You know, there's a way that we could try and do a kind of rolling usability study too. I don't know, rather than necessarily getting together and doing one-on-one focus groups, or at least we could do that. We could do individual interactions, but if we kind of try to figure out how to make that into something that other people could do too, it also would then become a replicable design process that Echo could eventually adopt also.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we were also thinking of this as the pitch to Packard for funding. So, yeah, I guess my struggle is how does this, if that's the scale project that we're thinking about doing, how do we do that with everything else that we are sustaining?
Yeah, capacity is a big question. This would be like a full court press, it seems, to do that well.
Well, and specifically, these are projects that involve a lot of coding, which is like specifically the people who are past capacity. So we would have to think about that a lot. On the other hand, as a funding proposal, like we can hire people to do these projects, and it's like a really cool job. But as we know, it's kind of hard to get people who are, interested in and excited about designing and executing without a large team, without a lot of direction.
Yeah, but we could fundraise for a project, maybe even 3 people's time if we wanted to really do this. And it feels like to me 3 different people's sorts of skill sets, people who are capable of doing like the coding work, people who are capable of doing the data analytic and visualization work, and people who are capable of thinking about the user study designs. And, it feels like 3 different sets of skills, and hard to find one person to do all of that. And we need somebody who's like really good at coordinating events if we were going to do that. Somebody who's really ready to get that toolkit ready, be on the phone, advising people on structuring events. That's an outgoing organizing type.
And as long as we're dreaming about positions we could fundraise for, I loved what you were saying earlier, Sarah, about, I think it was you, Sarah, about like if we had not just graphics, but maybe videos about like some of the things that we learn and identify. That might be even a much easier way to take the work we're already doing and make it much more accessible.
I mean, the thing I really like about this set of project areas is it definitely has legs under any change of governance. There'll be more need for this kind of thing if Trump or somebody similar remains in office. I think there's a real potential for us to actually inform ECHO if something else changes. So to me, it feels like a good pivot for us to kind of take the toolkit approach that we have developed for other things. So to me, it feels like a good sustainable funding, something that could carry us into another year, whereas another two years, which I'm not sure about for some of our other working areas.
I think that's a really good point. And also if it is a Riesta Packard and they're really interested in kind of solutions orientation, this project is, trying to take an already, useful database and make it like, and really make it help make it part of a much better interface for public knowledge about environmental governance and hopefully for accountability therein as well. Well, we are at time, and I want to respect everybody's time. I think this has been a very fruitful conversation. And I also want to give a plug that there will be a grant writing session associated with the in-person meeting. And if we want funding for this, we gotta write those grants. So, so if there's any passion for starting out some grant work before then, awesome. And then we can also just have this as one of our focus, something we focus on there as well.
I do think we've actually come quite a long way in documenting parts of this project now over the past few months. I think the work that Kelsey's been doing, writing up the conversations, is so valuable, and Eric chiming in is awesome. So I don't feel, I actually think we're, with some cutting and pasting and reorganizing, we're actually at least got a background description, problem description, and some, it's more about study design stuff and budget imagination, like budget figuring out.
Mm-hmm.
And the more that we could write it so it supported our current things, like writing in something for how would web monitoring relate to this, then it's not necessarily like an all or nothing thing. If we can figure out what parts of our other work would also support this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks for a great meeting, and especially thanks, Sarah and Eric, for sharing all that you've learned about this site over the last several months and years, and Rob for asking great questions. And see you all soon.
Everyone, take care.